Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this webcast, How to Build an Employee Performance Management and Compensation Planning Process that Drives Value, sponsored by CRG emPerform. This webcast has been pre-approved for HRCI and SHRM credit. Please be sure to attend the complete webcast in order to receive your credits. If you have any questions during the webcast, click on the Q&A tab in your webinar controls and type them there. A new tab will open in your browser with the webcast survey. Please be sure to complete it as soon as the webcast has ended. It is now my pleasure to turn it over to our presenter, John Smith.
Thanks very much, Hester, and thanks everyone for joining us today. So just off the top, this is a big topic, driving value from employee performance management and compensation planning. And we're going to talk here a little bit about alignment too. I do want to say it's a big topic, and we've covered these in more details. There's some HR.com presentations out there. One is on reviving the performance review, and another one's on the compensation side. So if you want to see more details than we cover in the next hour, I certainly encourage you to take a look at those. Just before we get started, I'll give a bit of background on myself. I've been working with and in the performance management space since 2003. We do have a product called emPerform, and I've been involved in over 100 probably or more performance management implementations over the years. Continue to talk to thousands of HR professionals every day about the performance management and compensation management processes. So a lot of what I bring to the presentation today is that sort of experience. In terms of our agenda, what we're going to go over, of course, the many moving parts of effective performance management and compensation planning, how we can align performance to rewards, making the case for performance management and compensation planning software. So we'll touch on the technology piece just a bit here at the end, and some real world examples and cases. And I think oftentimes as we go through presentations like this, one of the key things we can bring to it, and some of the value we can add, is sharing some real world examples, sharing some insight, sharing some practical advice and tips. And I hope today that you'll get some of that out of this. Of course, there's a ton of good literature out there you can read on these subjects, and we reference some of that as well as we go through this. So let's kick things off looking at the performance side. And I think we all know that the modern organization has moved to aligned processes. They're not all grouped together anymore. We actually have separate processes happening. And when we look at big buckets like compensation review and development planning and performance review, often what we're seeing in here are separate processes that need to be aligned. A lot of organizations nowadays, when they look at performance management, for instance, you figure out you've got these ongoing feedback bubbles happening all the time throughout the year. So no surprise that the biggest change we've seen over the last 20 years in the performance management space is this drive to continuous feedback. The idea that immediate feedback allows us to be nimbler, it allows quick course correction, and of course employees like it better because the feedback is timely and it's not end of the year, rear view mirror 9 months later. It makes sense in the moment. And so when we think about that concept and think about how it's changed performance management, I always come to three organizations that I love to talk about. And I think these are really important examples because GE, Adobe, and Deloitte have made fundamental changes, and they're all very different than one another. These organizations are important because in many ways they're trailblazers in this area. We all know they're large organizations, and that's something to think about as you think about an organization like one of these changing their performance management process. It's affecting tens of thousands and in some cases hundreds of thousands of employees. And for that reason, I think they deserve a bit of attention. All of these firms have shared the change they've made, and there's lots of literature out on the three of them. So let's just take a look at what they did and see what conclusions we can draw from it and what it actually means for us. Let's start with General Electric. And we probably all know General Electric because they were really helpful in making the traditional performance review very popular. They got a lot of press. came out of it. And as the years went by, it came to be known as a fairly rigid system that focused on scoring employees. It was known as a rank and yank system where the bottom 10% would be terminated. And they've made some pretty radical changes. They've made radical changes because they say millennials want more feedback. They want it fast. They want it mobile enabled. And GE has also become a very highly matrixed organization. So one employee could be closely connected to many other employees and many other managers as they go through their day-to-day work life. So what did they do for their performance management process? Well, they got rid of this classic sort of form and traditional approach, and they developed an internal feedback app called PD at GE, and it stands for Performance Development at GE. And this app exchanges voice and text input. You can attach documents to it and even handwritten notes, and it allows this continual communication between employees and managers and teams. Each employee can set a series of priorities in the app, and they can ask for insights from anyone they work with or provide feedback to other people. And one of the interesting things about it is they say there's no direct manager involvement in the employee's folder. So it's really become a technology app to really get well-rounded feedback, but it focuses on the employee themselves. Adobe also made some big changes, and they went from their time-consuming stacked ranking system that was very formal to a less formal and more frequent check-in system. And I'll tell you this, in fact, Adobe's so proud of this system and what they're doing, you can go out and Google Adobe Performance Management, and you can go right to their homepage, and they'll share with you lots of great material on how their process runs, instructions for employees and managers, and helpful tips. So I certainly encourage you to check it out. The big change they made is they went to ongoing discussions and check-ins. And the discussion covers three big topics: expectations, feedback, and growth and development. And the idea is these discussions happen real time, hopefully at a minimum, maybe quarterly. But there's no longer any ratings in the Adobe system. It's focused on continuous feedback. And they award merit through this performance management process, they say, by giving the manager a budget and educating them on the ranges and how to apply that to merit decisions. And the last organization of the three that I wanted to touch on was Deloitte, because like GE and Adobe, Deloitte has also made some significant changes. As you know, this is a professional services organization. They got rid of cascading objectives and deep numeric rankings and 360 reviews. They said they were spending 2 million collective hours a year assigning numerical ratings to employees. And what they did that's so different, they stopped asking people to weigh in on each other's performance and said, we're going to ask the manager 4 questions at the end of every quarter or the end of every project. And these 4 questions are going to give us a good guide as to how the employee is doing. And I'm going to come back to those 4 questions in a second. So we stand back and look at these 3 organizations and we say, you know what? They really have made significant changes. What does this say for the rest of us? And one of the things that it says for us as we look at it is that, boy, oh boy, it's confusing. I mean, just because they did it doesn't mean we should do it. And this is part of the challenge we find with performance management. One of the big challenges is there's not exactly a right way to do it. There's not exactly a black and white scenario that says, if I'm this organization, this is the approach I should take, or if this is my culture, this is the approach I would take. Over the years, what we've seen are really what our own observation says are 3 different models that we traditionally fit everybody we meet into one of these. When they talk about their performance management process, we say, the traditional performance management process is really what we term the classic one. And, the classic one is really steeped in, the traditional sort of performance review and ratings, and it's got a big backward orientation, and it looks what we did over the last year. The next model is what we call modern. And the modern model says, there's some things about the classic model we like, but we need to modernize it a bit. We need to bring more continuous feedback into it, for instance. And then, of course, we've got the radical model. And the radical model is actually where I'd put GE, Adobe, and Deloitte. The radical model says we're really ripping up the old way of doing things and starting over with something that looks completely, totally different. So I want to think about classic, modern, and radical for just a moment. Let's think about what those look like in terms of content inside a performance review if you're behind one of those three doors. The other thing we also see out there is that organizations often are moving from one model to the next, and or they've got different employee segments that use a different model, and that's possible. So if we think about these three review models, classic, modern, and radical, what do they look like? Okay, under the classic model, what we traditionally see are things like goals and objectives. They're usually set once a year at the beginning of the year or as a part of last year's review. Yeah, there's some competency and skill ratings that are done. Some people will put in company values, some do learning and development, and for sure the classic model has rating scales. And I wouldn't say 9 times out of 10, I was going to. Let's say 7 times out of 10, that rating scale, I guarantee you, is 5 levels, and it goes from exceeds expectations to needs improvement at the bottom. And it's, those iterations, it's the expectation rating scale that's used. The modern model is a little more interesting because it takes the best parts of the classic model, but it brings in more forward-looking and continuous feedback elements. It may bring in, we'll continue to look at goals and objectives and competencies, but we're going to take a look at and discuss quarterly accomplishments. And we're going to document maybe quarterly accomplishments, or we're going to do some ad hoc check-ins and discuss those. We're going to encourage continuous feedback, note-taking, employee and manager journaling, and we're going to have a place where that matters somehow in the overall performance review, where the documentation of that discussion supports the comments we're making. Hey, we're going to talk to the employee about career planning. We're going to talk to them about, how they're doing and what their plans are. We're going to talk to them about their health and well-being. And certainly, that's a big part of the conversations we see happening nowadays in this COVID era that we're living in. And when we go to radical, what changes there? Well, the radical models are still very focused on goals and objectives. If we think about traditional content areas, the one that doesn't drop is goals and objectives. It sometimes changes its names, like GE might call it priorities. Adobe might call it a roadmap. These are still a fundamental cornerstone. However, they're really, the radical model's different in that it's usually very focused on forward looking. Goals are forward looking. What are your career plans? Hey, what kind of feedback are you getting from your peers and giving to your peers? And what does this say about what we need to do going forward? So the radical model focuses on goals, career planning, and continuous feedback. And in almost every case, it drops rating scales. So with that said, I'm curious. I want to do our first poll in this presentation. Let's see a show of hands on how many of you would say your review type closely aligns to classic, modern, radical, or other or none at all. And we'll give you guys 30 seconds here to go through and provide some answers on this. And let's see what the presentation results say. And then we'll talk a little bit about what we're seeing and maybe why we're seeing that. And we'll see those results come in. And as I said, we'll give it another 10 to 15 seconds to get them in, and then we'll share them with everyone. Okay, and hopefully you've got a chance to bring that in. So here's what we're seeing. Classic model, 56% of the respondents saying that's where they line up. 108 respondents. 33% or 64 of you said modern, 4% or 8 of you said radical, and 7% said other. Very interesting results, and I have to say, not surprising. Not surprising why? Well, one of the things I want to tell you about is that our friends at HR.com recently did a great survey on the state of performance management in 2020. And I think my colleagues are going to make it available to you through chat. I encourage you to download this survey result report because it lines up with the science and the actual sort of results we're seeing here are similar to what we see in the survey. And what it actually says is over 50%, 53% of the respondents still do a once a year performance review. Now that's an improvement over 2 years ago when they asked the same question and the answer was 70% are still doing the once a year review. Now it's at 53. So this is the same results we always see. If you go back and look at Reviving the Performance Review presentation, and we've done these out at the SHRM chapter shows, it always falls in this scenario. We see, a lot of classic, a movement to the modern, 33, 40, 50% in classic, 30, 35% in the modern, and then usually like 10% and less in radical. And the interesting thing is it's the radical firms that are getting all of the press, right? And Main Street North America is actually not moving in the direction of radical. Main Street North America is probably staying in classic land and trying to figure out how to make it better and trying to modernize it a bit. And certainly that's what we see. Now, is the reason that radical is not more adopted, what is the reason behind that? There can be lots of them, right? One thing is that you have to have scale to be able to create sort of a new performance paradigm and get the buy-in. Oftentimes when I sit in meetings in HR departments, is the HR team's 100% behind it, but they're concerned that the rest of the organization may not follow. So there's an element of organizational readiness. There's also some key questions that have to be answered about alignment. Key questions about, how do we align to reward? How do we align to merit? How do we align to promotion? And then detailed questions like, are we going to continue with our goal focus? And if we're going to incorporate continuous feedback, what exactly does that mean? Are our managers ready for this? Are they trained to give continuous feedback? And so these are some important questions to answer. Another one that's extremely important, and I want to touch on it here for a second, is the concept of ratings. Because when we look at this performance management literature that's come out over the last 3 or 4 years, probably starting around 2015, 2016 maybe, there's been a big focus on saying, should we keep ratings? Should we get rid of ratings? Some people think if you get rid of ratings, you're going to solve all the problems with performance management. And so it's not so simple, because if we get rid of the ratings, we got to have a way to understand the value chain as it relates to decisions on compensation and decisions on of course, rewards and promotion and other items. So I want to spend a minute thinking about these ratings and talking about them. And we spend a lot of time on this with our clients and over the years talking about the right rating scales. I just want to give you some examples here. I will note that we have a rating scale guidebook that you can take a look at. It's been very popular. It's been downloaded a lot from the website. Just giving you some samples, and I'm going to give you a few here to think about as well. So let's just talk briefly about rating scales. First of all, there's some side effects. The wrong rating scale can break the whole process, and we know that, right? If it's confusing to employees and managers, if it lets bias drive ratings instead of facts, if we see employees starting to feel like they're not being rated fairly or accurately, they can paint an inaccurate picture of performance in the organization. And I've got some examples I'm going to share today of that. Preventing appraisal data from identifying high and low performers, inhibiting the manager's ability to gauge progress and development needs. Oh boy, this is the worst. Losing trust in any process that follows rewards and promotions. So rating scales actually are very important. Now that HR.com state of performance management survey that you're going to look at, guess what it says about metrics on performance management? It says the number one metric coming out of performance management is ratings. And the survey says 72% of the respondents found their number one performance management metric is ratings. Well, that should probably be no surprise, because in the classic model and the modern model, we use ratings. Now the question is, how do we get the ratings right? Some people have said, don't bother, just get rid of them. Use no ratings at all. And at first you stand back and think about it, and you're like, pretty good in theory, maybe that would work. Maybe we'd get more buy-in. Maybe employees would feel more engaged. But as you look deeply into it, that's not the case. What we end up with is what we call shadow ratings or ghost ratings. We still have to have a way to assess performance. We have to have a way to say, give it some meaning. So that maybe there's a management meeting when we're awarding compensation. And if we're living in the no rating world, what happens? Well, the managers get in a room, close the door, and unofficially rate people. So we need to think this through because we want to make sure it doesn't actually lead to more bias. And we want to make sure that it doesn't become an unofficial ranking system. So when we think about that, we go, well, let's really talk about rating scales then and think about what they need to do. What are the commandments? And, there's some important ones here. I think we have 10 listed. And I'm going to say that number 2, ratings must be tied to the content they're measuring is really important. We know they need to be clear. They can't distract. They need to be simple. There's a big movement out there to making rating scales text-based and getting away from numbers. Wherever possible, let's factor in multiple sources, self-assessments, peer 360 review. They can be dynamic and change during the evaluation period. Number 9 is extremely important. They should be calibrated formally by review. Okay. And number 10, even the most important, employees need to understand how ratings and measures are tied to rewards. So, take away from this 2, 9, and 10, and you'd say, okay, we'll be able to build a case for aligning performance to what comes next. All right, so here's some examples. When we look at something like goals, you would say, well, what do you use for goals then? What you would never hear our team recommend is the meets expectations scale, right? Significantly exceeds expectations, meets expectations. We all know that one's out there. If we look at number 2, commandment number 2, it was let's get the rating scales to match the content that we're rating on. And to me, that's always been the biggest driver. And of course, we're no experts in this. You can take away from this what you like, and there's lots of literature out there. But if we were making a recommendation, we'd say, hey, let's look at these, for instance. So has the goal been met? Has the goal partially met? Is it not met? Has it been deferred? Where are we with it? Or lots of clients use that completion scale when they look at goals and objectives, because you just want to get an assessment of where's the goal or objective. And of course, there's other ones that like to put some narrative into it and make it interesting to read. The important part about goals is that they need to be structured correctly if they're going to be rated. And when we look at these goals or objectives, even if you look at the Adobe toolkit, you'll see a very smart goal setting like setup. And in that HR.com survey, I think they say in there that smart goal setting remains a key driver of how to set goals and objectives. If we use a SMART criteria and establish the goal with some great narrative around it, with some structure around it, we should be able to apply one of these rating scales. And really, both the employee and manager shouldn't probably have too much disagreement on where the goal is if it's been structured properly. If we've determined when the target date is and how it's going to be measured and the key milestones, we should be able to arrive at an assessment like this fairly quickly. Another one we look at is the competency side and behaviors. And the behaviors continue to be an important part of the classic and modern performance review. Oftentimes are the basis of important developmental discussions, as well as discussions about, hey, I saw you at your best when you were, in this moment and delivering this. One of the big ones I've been a fan of ever since we started this was Dick Groat's observation frequency scale. That's the one on the left. So give him credit for that. You can take a look at his literature there. And it goes very simply: seldom observed, sometimes observed, observed, and consistently observed. And it's a way of saying, here as your manager, or even as a 360 peer, here's how often I see that in the work you're doing. And that's a good indication to the employee of where they sit, is how do people see these behaviors? We also see advanced proficient developing and strength and development area type scenarios like on the right-hand side. So these are important. But let's cycle back to Deloitte, because Deloitte said, I'm not going to have a rating scale, but I am going to ask 4 questions. Well, here's Deloitte's 4 questions. And this might be the answer to those of you who are sitting out there in the no rating camp saying, well, how are we going to, tie our performance review to rewards and recognition or compensation? Let's take a look at what Deloitte does. After every project, after quarterly, annually, given what I know of this person's performance, and if it were my money, would I award this person the highest possible compensation increase and bonus? And it's a 5-point scale, strongly agree to strongly disagree. Question 2, given what I know of the person's performance, would I always want him or her on my team? Again, same 5-point scale, strongly agree to strongly disagree. Question 3, is this person at risk of low performance? Yes or no? And question 4, is this person ready for a promotion today? Yes or no? So although there's no ratings, if we had answers to these, we would be able to start to gain, a little bit of understanding as to where everyone falls. And so these would be good ones to think about. Sometimes we show these to clients and they say, gee, I really like those. I want to change the wording a bit, or maybe I want to add a 5th question. So instead of a rating on goals and objectives and competencies, we're just asking 4 or 5 questions that will help us understand where everybody is. So, this is a really quick tour through performance. And again, there's lots of pieces out there. You can look at our Reviving the Performance Review webinar to learn more about this. But if we were going to summarize here what makes the effective performance management process, it's starting to think about planning for the change and thinking about the outcome. How will this support compensation? How will it support reward and recognition? Don't boil the ocean. That's one of my favorite expressions. Don't boil the ocean. What we found over time is gradual changes to the process generally work better than the big bang in most organizations. So it can evolve over time. We could change something up this year, and we could say our goal is to have ad hoc, documented, continuous feedback conversations happening in 3 years. And in year 1, what we're going to do is look at the content a little bit and maybe change up the rating scales. We need to make sure that there's a forward-looking orientation in these performance reviews. There's no question about that. Employees want that. They don't want to feel that it's all rear view mirror looking backward. And the best performance reviews have a bit of a blend, but a big focus on the forward-looking piece. More voices in the process is always going to help. And so a process, a technology tool that supports that is a great way to improve the performance management process. And lastly, as we've said throughout this, think carefully about these content and ratings. Think carefully about both of those because they can have a big impact. So I want to share an example. One of our clients we worked with recently, this is a 2,000 employee hospital in Indiana. And the hospital was looking to implement a performance management process that, guess what, was goal-oriented, forward-thinking, and helped to promote continuous feedback. The organization had to make sure that the new process fit with their culture, one they call an uncommon leader culture, where process improvements are empowered by employees and they bring ideas forward and bring them to action. And they're looking for exceptional people doing exceptional work. And that one of the big things for this organization that was that performance would continue to play a part in what determines the merit increases. However, the goal, and this is their words, not mine, was to remove the stigma that the only purpose of performance evaluations is to get a salary rate increase. So we were literally walking into an environment where the performance review, in the eyes of the employee, was a one-to-one relationship with compensation. It was a ticket to compensation. It was a gate you went through to get a merit increase. What did they do? Well, if we stand back and look what they did using our methodology, we'd say they made the move from classic to modern. How did they move from classic to modern? One of the first things we had to do was say, focal date doesn't work in a hospital. It doesn't work when we have a manager out there who has 110 direct reports and you're asking the manager to give feedback to 110 people in 4 weeks in February. It just doesn't work. It destroys the whole value proposition of performance management and employee growth and the uncommon leader and all of the stuff we're talking about. It doesn't fit. So the first thing we had to do was move away from the focal date and introduce anniversary date. And the basis was to make sure managers and employees could have an effective dialogue. That was the reason why. It was purely not enough time in the day during the month of February. We disconnected by doing the anniversary move and by taking away, let me rephrase that. By taking down the focal date and moving to anniversary, we implicitly disconnected performance management and compensation. The compensation and merit reward process still happens at one point in the year at the hospital, but these performance management discussions are happening throughout the year on the anniversary date. The next thing is, within the technology application, we encourage continuous feedback. And there's a continuous feedback element in our product called Tag that they're going to use. Quarterly check-ins are being suggested, but not mandated. The mid-year review is a formal step. The quarterly review is a suggestion, but not a requirement. And because it's a healthcare environment, because they're subjected to accreditation and other policies, 360 review remains there. And it's a big part of what the nurses go through, but they felt nurses shouldn't just have to do it because of compliance and certification. We should broaden that and let other people provide feedback when they want to. The last change they made was changing up the rating scales, and they went to the recommended observation frequency scale on the competency side and the goal progress scale that we saw. And so that's a big change from classic to modern. That's what they did. They reintroduced it, and they're getting a lot of good feedback from employees that have seen it so far. It's still early stages, but everyone seems to be pretty excited about it. Okay, so this is a big topic we're doing today. In the first half, we talk about performance, and in the second half, we talk about compensation. So let's turn our attention to compensation planning and talk a little bit about compensation strategy and review challenges, and maybe the challenges we see with aligning compensation and performance, because that's the big ticket for this presentation today. So here's the top challenges we see all the time. We know the annual compensation review process is tedious, time-consuming, and expensive. We like to think about these 3 Ps: purpose, people, and process. We know when we stand back looking at this, oftentimes we see stressed HR departments gathering competitive data. Managers are conducting performance discussions with direct reports. There's multiple rounds of informal calibration happening through voice and face-to-face meetings and calls that are happening, to emails flying around. Excel workbooks are making their way through the organization's email, with managers making changes and cases for making the case for compensation changes. And oftentimes the managers want to, make changes that are outside the norm. Salary budgets are being squeezed, and tough decisions need to be made. And we leave it to managers to review the final results. And it's just a lot of effort to get through this process, and oftentimes people aren't really excited, elated, or satisfied with the outcome. And so if we want to improve this, what do we need to do? Well, what we're going to talk about is, very quickly, a well-polished compensation strategy, a formal calibration process, and the role technology can play in assisting in this. So let's just take a quick look at these 3 bullet points and what they mean. And again, these are big topics, right? We could do, an hour just on compensation strategy. And sometime I'd love to do an hour just on calibration, because I think calibration is one of the biggest missing links in a lot of these performance to comp processes. And it's really not that it's the missing link, it's the formal part, formal calibration. So I want to talk a little bit about that as well. So let's say compensation strategy. Well, as our clients, and as I've learned over the years, it's been explained to me, they break it down really simply. They'd say, hey, John, when we look at compensation strategy, we're trying to do 3 things: ensure internal equity, maintain market equity, and reward performance. 3 important pillars of compensation strategy. Internal equity, I think we all know that, hey, this is about the relative worth of jobs within the organization, and parity between jobs and parity between individuals in the same job. And we know it's important because employees observe other employees in the same job and make judgments. Employees observe other people in different jobs and make judgments about it. And that is just a reality of work life that I think happens in probably every organization. So we often talk about the importance of internal equity when we make these compensation decisions, ensuring that we're not sacrificing this important pillar of our compensation strategy. We're keeping things fair and standard across the board. Market equity becomes another pillar that's extremely important. And probably all of you know this better than me, because a lot of you will go out and do surveys and get a real good look at where your organization stands in terms of industry and in terms of how other organizations in the industry are paying for similar positions. And so always the tip is to, use reliable sources for your market pay survey. Make sure the details are there, that, the jobs are reviewed in your external market and match as closely as possible, and look at experience level and education, certification, job location, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Oftentimes for us, when we go through a comp process, that survey data makes its way into, salary ranges for the position, and ultimately, midpoint and comp ratio falls out of that. In the performance side, it gets more interesting. And I'm curious about this with all of you who are on the call today. We see a lot of organizations moving to a pay for performance strategy to attract, retain, and motivate employees. And I'm just curious, let's take a poll here. I'd like to see a show of hands. How many on the call would say they have implemented a formal pay for performance program? Yes, no? Planning on it? Not applicable. And let's see where the results come in on this one, on this side. I'm curious how much of you have pay for performance as part of your compensation strategy. Let's take a look. And like before, we'll give you a few seconds here. We'll give you another 15 seconds to get your answers in, and then we'll take a look at what it says. All right, so what are we seeing here? What we're seeing in terms of poll results is that pretty even, almost split between yes and no. We've got 38% of the respondents saying they have it, 39% saying they don't, 16% say they're planning on it, and 6% saying it's not applicable. So, all right, we'll close this off and we'll talk a little bit about this, because if you've implemented pay for performance, you've probably thought about some design considerations. If you haven't implemented pay for performance, you're probably thinking about some design considerations. And what are those big considerations? Well, a couple things we have to figure out. Are we ready for pay for performance? Is the culture going to support it? If not, is management committed to changing it? What are the goals for pay for performance? We try to improve recruitment and retention, increase individual performance, greater fairness in pay, all of the above. Who should be paid for performance? Is it everybody? Is it only frontline workers? I think we'd all agree right now in this COVID era that those frontline workers deserve it. Top level managers, anybody who is being paid for this? What should the timing be for implementing pay for performance? Is it everyone all at once, or are we going to do it in stages and roll it out? What should be rewarded? This is a very interesting one, right? When we think about the alignment to performance, what should be rewarded? Is it individual, team, and organizational achievements? Is it short and long-term goals? Is it effort versus outcome when there are constraints that exist? How should employees be rewarded? Is it cash, one-time bonus? Is it an increase in base pay? I mean, if you're lucky enough to have stock options, is it stock or common shares? Is it a combination of any of these items? How much of their pay should be contingent on performance? What percentage of their total comp should performance affect? And lastly, hey, let's not forget this part. What's the impact to the annual organizational budget? What are the financial considerations or constraints that we have to think about when we implement this pay for performance piece? And ultimately, when you go through this, a key decision that'll need to be made is, are we striving to create a goal attainment plan where we're going to define and disclose the thresholds and targets and the maximums that can be achieved? Or is it going to be a discretionary plan where at the end of the year, at the end of the performance period, we look at the results and determine payouts based on a review of how the performance went over the last year? Ultimately, you'll end up in one of those two camps. Now, it's interesting to think about the role of performance inside compensation. A survey that was done by Mercer, I found very interesting because it looked at what drives compensation changes. And the thing I noticed in this survey was whether we looked at base salary, short-term incentive and bonus, or spot bonus, in every category, you're going to see individual performance factoring into it. And if individual performance is factoring into it, then we have to stand back and say, okay, we need a good way to identify individual performance. And that leads right back to the first half of this presentation today. So if we've thought about compensation strategy and have that in place, and we've done our performance side, we need to have this important discussion about calibration. And I think calibration is somewhat of a missing link in a lot of these processes. My reflection working with many of our clients is that a more formal calibration process would help improve their process internally. So, what are we talking about with calibration? Well, at first glance, you can say, do we have the right ratings on people? But this is also, more about, do we have a good sense of the individual performance contributions? And it may mean that we get managers together as a group to provide their feedback and look at overall ratings to ensure that they're equitable, to ensure that we have consistency and fairness being applied. How do we do this? Well, here's some tips. We schedule calibration meetings in advance in a timeline with key dates to all managers. So if we were looking at a year-end process that said we're going to close performance reviews at the end of January and we're going to make compensation decisions in the month of March, and effective April 1st, we'll roll out new merit, we'll roll out new comp and the merit changes, then we might say, okay, during February, we're going to have formal calibration meetings after everyone's done their reviews. We recommend planning for in-person meeting participation versus a conference call. We made that recommendation before COVID hit us. So the reality of the situation is we're living in the COVID world now, and we all know everything's remote. But the important piece is to make sure there's some discussion. It's not done through email, okay? The next piece is that ensure the meetings are held before managers conduct their individual performance review meetings with employees, and certainly before any comp decisions are made. So that would be a best practice that few can do because of the timelines and the amount of work involved in closing out their performance reviews. But if you could hold off on your final review meeting with the employee until there's been a calibration session, you might feel better armed for that discussion because you'll understand how the other members of the organization are being reviewed and rated, and what other managers are saying about, hey, what it makes to be an all-star, what it makes to be a role model, what it takes to be a role model. Some other tips in terms of calibration. Managers should thoroughly complete draft performance appraisals on their direct reports and be prepared to discuss the ratings and share them with their peer managers in a group setting. If you're going to do a suggested performance distribution, you need to communicate that in advance so it doesn't come as a surprise during the calibration meeting. Let managers know when they go into review season that there's going to be a performance distribution that's used. And facilitate by making sure you go to that meeting armed with the performance data, that you've looked at it, that you've run averages across the company, that you know the managers that tend to rate really, really high and tend to rate lower, so that we can identify the outliers right away. Now, one of the best practices we have is you could use a Ninebox, and this has been very popular with many organizations for facilitating these calibration discussions. One of my favorite reads I've had is One Page Talent Management, and I think it's a New York Times bestseller. One of the authors, there's a couple of authors there, I know one of them is Mark Efron, and he's a big believer in Ninebox. And Ninebox is absolutely a great way to calibrate performance review results. If you get the luxury of a technology platform, it's nice because you can allow managers to actually see their team. Some organizations will say, show me my team in relation to the rest of the organization. It gives us a little bit of interactiveness on terms of what do these results mean. And what we also see is some of these clients that start to equate the box with what it means for merit. So if you're in the top right corner where we've got the two people in the screenshot, Harlan and May in this example, the high performance, high potential employees likely has a relationship to the merit and the merit award that's going to be given to them. And so this can be a great way to bring together a team of managers, put this on the wall and say, okay, this is what we see from a Ninebox perspective. Very, very popular tool and a great tool to use for calibration. One of the other things that we can do before we jump into calibration or during the calibration meeting is ask some important questions. And so calibration isn't just about performance review and ratings. Calibration is also saying we need to understand these other factors. We need to understand when we're going to look at the merit pool that we're going to award over the process, how many employees here would be due for a promotion? Are there employees that need an adjustment to maintain internal equity? Because maybe they've really grown in terms of their skill set and experience over the last year. Are there employees who need a market adjustment? Just for whatever reason, that role is falling out of market. I don't know what the reason is, but we need to give this person a market adjustment. So it will be really good to know the answers to this question as well, because the next step in the process is to build the business case for the compensation budget. And this is where you're going to take the calibrated results, your competitive data in terms of your internal and market equity, the people that need promotion, and you're going to maybe do an employee engagement survey and do some turnover analysis. And you're going to take that to have your conversation with finance, to have the conversation with the CFO and the management team about what the budget for compensation increases needs to look like for the next 12 months. And so if we could do these processes, we've really tied together performance, calibration, and compensation, and we're ready for that merit review process as a next step. So when we jump into the merit review process, what are we actually doing here? What we're saying is, first, we got to prepare. And we all know this is the tough part. This is, for a lot of organizations, this is really ugly. I work closely with one of our clients right now and just trying to address this through an automated fashion to say, hey, listen, when we get the data together for the annual merit review process, we've got to get all the employees and the current salary data. We've got to look at off-cycle increases that were given since the last round of merit review. We've got salary or market data that may play into this. We've got midpoints to establish and defend, comp ratio calculations to bring in. We've got to look at proration and how that factors into our policy on merit. Ultimately, how we're going to come up with recommendations. Are we going to have a grid that says at a certain level of performance, you're eligible for a certain percentage, or at a certain level of where you are relative to midpoint or comp ratio, this is where the recommendation will come through. And so armed with this, we'll go say, okay, we've got our data. Now we've got to talk about how the process is going to run. What's the workflow behind it? And I'll tell you, this is an interesting one for us on the technology side, because, if you're looking at technology to do both performance and comp, what I would say here is be very careful to ensure that the comp tool doesn't enforce the same hierarchy that performance review has. And what we found 9 times out of 10, when we have clients that do both performance and comp with us, is that the hierarchy of review on performance appraisal is different than the hierarchy used for compensation review. What we typically see in the compensation review process is higher level management involvement than performance reviews. So we got to determine who makes the decisions for what group of people, and who's ultimately involved in the back and forth and final negotiation on this merit review process. Then, of course, we've got to think about timing, and timing is key here. We know the annual process is most efficient when it's done after the performance review process, but that doesn't mean we want it tied to it. Oftentimes, the timing aspect is, say, on an annual merit process is 3 to 6 weeks. I'd say on average, that's what we see at our clients. We go in and sort of freeze the employee manager relationship when we go into the comp review process, so that for that 3 to 6 week period, even if somebody changes, for the purposes of compensation review, they're looking at the manager they worked with for the last year. It allows communication with employees. We need to make sure we have enough time to do that. We have to make sure we have enough time to get the data we need into whatever system following the process, back to the payroll system, for instance, so that it's ready to go on the effective date. Lots of key elements in terms of timing. And that big discussion point is a separate process and a separate conversation. The example of the hospital that we brought up in Indiana. this was a big driver for them. They really needed to separate performance and comp discussions because in the eyes of employees, it was one and the same. One was a gate into the next. And it was really hurting the value of the performance process. It was really, sort of hurting the value of the compensation or merit review process as well. And so this is an important conversation to have. And the question is whether or not you can separate it in reality. And in practice, I found it's not that hard to do. We do it internally at our own organization. And what we do, to be crystal clear, is we have discussions about performance. And then, we say when compensation comes up, there will be a discussion about compensation, but that's not the discussion we're having today. But we will come back, and this is the timing for the compensation discussion. And yes, this discussion will play into the compensation discussion, but today's discussion is about performance. Compensation is a separate discussion. And so that's something you want to think about. Now, the last piece that's of course, important to say is the role of technology. And again, if you refer back to this HR.com State of Performance Management survey that's been chatted out to you, you'll actually see that one of the principles that's in here, and one of the things the respondents are seeing, is that it says major finding number 6, okay, on page 5, performance management technologies have become more common and have multiple capabilities, and more organizations are using technology for performance management. It cites 71%, an increase of 9 percentage points from 2019. So, there's no question that performance management technology is going to help automate the process. It's a tool, and I always call it, and, even when we do our demos and discussions and even on the sales side of things, it's an enabler to a better process. It's an enabler to making the process easier for people. But ultimately, our successful clients are the ones that have started with a vision for performance and comp. They've got a vision for what they want to do, and they use technology to bring their vision to life, to automate it. Certainly, we know it's going to help keep people on track with timelines. It gives them email reminders and all that good stuff. It allows us to collect and centralize data. I also think in the world of compensation, it's extremely important that it keeps the data secure and backed up. It's not sitting in Excel spreadsheets, in email inboxes. It's sitting in a database that's subjected to backup with proper security and privacy protocols built all around it. So that's a big part of it. Technology certainly, we don't even need to say this. We know technology is going to allow ongoing feedback and performance development. And, one of the things we see happening in COVID is this increase in remote feedback, continuous feedback that's happening because managers and employees are checking in to see how everybody's doing. A lot more focus on health and well-being right now as well. And I think we've all learned from COVID. I think it'll be a big demarcation point. And when we look back and say pre-COVID and post-COVID, we know how much role technology has played. It's allowed us all to join this webinar today. It's allowed us to continue to work from home. I know I spend the vast majority of my day on these virtual meeting platforms. Our big one we use is Teams, and we spend a lot of time on that, but certainly Zoom and GoToMeeting and all these ones that our clients are using and we're using as well are great tools to help us communicate. And the same thing applies to performance management and compensation technology. Of course, a picture's worth 1,000 words. What if the compensation process looked like this? You had a grid on your screen, and you saw, managers coming in and seeing the groups of people that are assigned to them. So when they log into their group, they see their direct reports. They see performance measures that were established so that we get accurate results coming from performance review. We see some market benchmarks in terms of midpoint and comp ratio, current salary. We see recommended increase or bonuses that are based on the strategy we've rolled out. And we give the managers, the most important part, we give them the guidelines and the intelligence to make decisions about how to award that merit. We give them a pool of dollars. Finance will like the track that we keep them on budget with what's been decided through the negotiation on the compensation side. And these are all really critical things that a technology tool can help with. Obviously makes the calculations automatic and sends it around for routing and approval to make sure we get it approved correctly and in the right time frame. The other thing that comes out of it, of course, is the output is a click away. So we can see total organizational add up. We can see by department. We can see the pre and post decisions, and allows us to make executives and the HR team to make decisions to ensure that we've got standardization and fairness through the process. And lastly, we can turn around and give the employee a professional looking, compensation statement or merit statement. And, more and more we see clients calling these total benefit statements and not focusing just on dollars, but adding all the other things that the organization does to the statement. And so I think technology really can help with the process we've laid out. Last one, an example of somebody who's embraced this. So I work closely with a firm in New Jersey. They're a pharmaceutical firm. They're about 300 employees in the US, bigger around the world, let's say. They came from a classic performance review approach, I'll call it. It had ratings and goals and competencies. But their big difference was that they're really highly focused on their compensation process with performance-based variables. And really, it is a very detailed plan that they give out. So what they did is they sort of moved from classic to, I'll call it modern plus. Somewhere between modern and radical is where they sit on the performance review side. They did remove performance ratings from the process. And the reason they removed performance ratings from their process was because they were finding that the performance review ratings they were getting in review never stood up in the calibration sessions that they had. When they went into calibration, all of a sudden the review scores that came out after calibration looked totally different than the review scores in performance review. And they couldn't reconcile them. So they said, you know what? We're going to try taking away the review ratings. And what they did instead was they implemented a formal technology tool with us called a quick check, where they asked managers to go in during the performance review process and give feedback on the employee, just to say, how are they doing in terms of performance, high, medium, low? Do they need an internal equity adjustment or a market equity adjustment? And they asked some questions, and they used the results of this quick check to negotiate the compensation award and the program and what it's going to look like. So coming out of review, they're ready for the compensation review process, but they've had a really good gut feel and gut check on what it's going to say when they come out of it. And so their heavy emphasis on calibration really allowed them to get rid of the sort of formal ratings in the review process. So I think if we stand back and look at this and say, how do we build an effective performance management and compensation planning process that drives value? It's 4 key points: reliable individual and institutional performance management, a well-developed compensation strategy that's totally transparent, a calibration process, the missing link, a formal calibration process to finalize performance before compensation review. And of course, if you're lucky enough to have it, a technology platform that'll help automate the process is a definite bonus. I'm just going to take a quick look here to see if there's any questions I can answer very quickly. And let's see. Deloitte's 4 questions. Are those transparent with answers available to employees? Now, that is a question I honestly don't know the answer to. I'm quite certain there's been so much written about that you would be able to do a quick Google search and see that. And following this, I'm going to check that out, and we will follow up with you. I'll see what I can find. How to do a calibration meeting in this remote environment is another question that comes up. And I think the key there is it's the GoToMeeting Zoom calls. It's the Microsoft Teams calls. It's basically bringing together all of the performance review data that we said, getting your managers on a call, structuring an agenda, sharing your feedback with them and your analysis and what the data is telling you, and asking for feedback. And I think if you start with that, my gut feeling is the conversation will lead itself naturally following that. And last question, how do you establish a calibration process? Just looking at our time. Very quickly, we've brought some pieces in here, but it's all about making sure we have the right data at the right time. So following performance review before we go into compensation, best practice says, let's have these calibration meetings even before the managers give feedback to the employees. And I think that's what I've got for today. We continue to ask your questions if you like, and we'll try to get back to all of you. I'd like to turn this back over to Hester to close it off. Thank you for your time, everyone.
I'd like to thank our presenter as well as all of you for joining us today.